So I'm going to talk to you today about partial aggregation. Okay, so as you know, we're in Oxford, and in GPI, people are very interested in long-termism, the idea that we should prioritize the far future an awful lot. So the standard kinds of arguments for this usually at least rely on something like this. We can help future people, at least with a small probability. There are loads and loads of those future people. And because there are loads of future people, helping them matters an awful lot, even though there was only a small chance of it working out. And in particular, because there are so many of them, helping them matters more than helping present people. And then the conclusion is that we should help future people rather than present people. So this argument, I think, should ring alarm bells for many skeptics of aggregation, because compare it to the following argument. Suppose we're choosing between saving a large number of people from headaches or a smaller number of people from deaths. We could help the people with headaches, at least by a small amount. There are loads and loads of those people. Because there are loads of those people, helping them would matter a lot, even though we help each person only a small amount. So we should prevent the headaches rather than the death. So skeptics of aggregation will think that this argument is fishy. And because it looks an awful lot like this argument, they might think that this one is also fishy. In other words, the objection to long-termism here is that long-termism presupposes full aggregation, the view that you can always aggregate benefits and harms. And they go on to say that full aggregation is false, and then they want to conclude that long-termism is false. And then the premise they're going to reject is this one, that because there are loads and loads and loads of future people, helping them matters an awful lot, morally speaking. So the question I'm going to ask in this talk is, does this objection work? And the answer, I think, is no. I'm going to sort of try and speed through this. The talk was originally designed for 1 hour, and I only realized recently that I've got 40 minutes for this, and I really do want to hear objections and why this theory is all wrong. So I'm just going to speed through. I might jump through the objections quite quickly, but they're on the handouts if you want to take a look at them. So here are sort of three views about aggregation. The first one is full aggregation that we've mentioned before. This is the view that harms and benefits can always aggregate. And even quite small harms and benefits, if there are enough of them, can outweigh large benefits or harms to the view. Then there's no aggregation. We can think of this as the view that you may or even must prevent one death rather than 1 million cases of paralysis. This view, however, has an unfortunate implication, which is quite absurd, which is that you may or must prevent one death rather than 1 million cases of paralysis. And therefore, I think that this view should be rejected. So partial aggregation is kind of the sweet spot in between the two. So for those who find it plausible that we should prevent deaths rather than any number of headaches, it says that, but it still allows for adding up benefits and harms sometimes in the cases where most people find it plausible. So I'm going to put on my partial aggregation hat during this talk. I will still be interested, if you've got a killer objection to partial aggregation, yeah, still do tell me about it. But I'm mostly interested in what is the best version of this view, because after all, I'm trying to assess it as an objection to long-termism. I don't think it would be very interesting to say the objection from partial aggregation is wrong because full aggregation is true, even if that is the case. So in particular, the version of partial aggregation that I'm going to focus on is probably the most popular, and it's due to Alex Verhoeven. So I've written it all up there, but let me just sort of explain to you what it is. You can look back at this on the handout if you like. Basically, as this view. You decide that some harms are irrelevant or relevant to each other depending on how the sizes of these compare. Paralysis is relevant to death, headaches are irrelevant to death. More generally, when something is too small compared to a larger harm, then it's irrelevant. But if it's large enough compared to the larger harm, then it's relevant. All you do is you take all of the stuff that's irrelevant and you put it straight into the bin. And then you just aggregate the rest as normal. I'm also going to be thinking about long-term interventions with these kinds of features, which I think are quite common, especially when people are doing things like trying to prevent various catastrophic risks. So with these kinds of interventions, there's a very small probability that they'll work out at all. But if they do work out, they make a very large difference to the lives of a huge number of future people. So for the purpose of this talk, forget about the non-identity problem, although it is important. I think there are cases where the non-identity problem doesn't seem to be a decisive problem here. So consider what EAs like to call S risks. So small risks that there will be very many people with suffering lives in the future, all plausible moral views agree that it's important to avoid producing people who have terrible lives. And so we can kind of like set the non-identity problem aside in at least some cases. I'm also going to say, forget about fanaticism. I'm just going to assume that the kinds of probabilities we're dealing with, while quite small, are large enough that we couldn't feasibly just ignore them. So I'm thinking like along the lines of maybe like 1 in 10,000 to a 1 in a million probability. You know, sure, a 1 in a million probability isn't that big, but if the government just decided to, you know, have a 1 in a million risk of a nuclear war just for a laugh, I'd be a bit upset with them. So on that basis, it seems kind of like unlikely that you should always ignore 1 in a million risks, even when there are really momentous events like nuclear war or human extinction. So this is the central case I'm going to consider. And again, this is like a complicated case, but let me just tell you like what it amounts to. You can either, with a 1 in 10,000 probability, save a lot of people, or for certain, you can save a small number of people. And we set up the numbers such that if you were to have the 1 in 10,000 chance of saving a lot of people, the expected number of people saved would be significantly greater. So the question is whether we ought to save the larger number of people from the small risks of death, just because if we were to succeed, we would prevent a large number of people from suffering death. So notice again the difference between the sort of typical partial aggregation type case I put at the beginning, where we compare deaths to headaches, and this. It's always significant harms that are at stake. They're always large harms. What's small is just the probabilities. So our question is basically this. In cases like deaths versus risks of death, the case just before, are the small risks of death relevant or are they irrelevant on this aggregate relevant claims? My answer is going to be that we should say that they are relevant. There's a more general question, which is how should we apply or how should we adapt theories of partial aggregation to cases of risk? So cases where you don't know what's going to happen, but you've got some kind of probability distribution over what's going to happen. And my answer is going to be that we should accept something like what I call the ex ante claims ex post relevance view. And hopefully I'll be able to explain this well enough. It's kind of complicated, but hopefully it will be okay. Okay, so let's begin though with just looking at the sort of two standard views in the literature. So these are the ex ante view of partial aggregation and the ex post view. So with the ex ante view, what you do is you take each person individually and you ask, what is the expected effect on their well-being? You use that to give them the size of their claim. And you decide whether their claim is relevant based on whether that claim, i.e. the expected loss of well-being, is large enough compared to the largest competing claim. The ex post view is a little bit different. It says that we should pay attention to the risk of anyone being harmed, not a particular person. So to help bring these two out, imagine that we have an action that's sure to, so imagine that we could prevent somebody from being killed, but we're uncertain who it will be. On the ex ante view, those many people who we will make a small difference to will all have small claims. On the ex post view, someone will have a large claim. So the important thing to say about both of these views is that both of them are united in saying that long-termism is a little bit silly. And that's because they both say that when we have an intervention that only with a small probability prevents, say, a catastrophe, there's only ever small claims in play. On the ex ante view, each individual person only has a small probability of being affected. That claim is small, so it gets counted as irrelevant next to things that we could do today, like saving people's lives, for sure. On the ex post view, on the other hand, it's still true that there's a very small chance of someone being gravely harmed. And because of that, the ex post view also agrees that the claims there are only small and thus count as irrelevant. So these are the two standard views, but I think both of them are unsatisfactory. So the first problem I'm going to talk about with the ex ante view is pretty familiar. It's got many advantages, I think, but it's not quite right. In particular, it's not quite right because it's false. So consider this case, which I call death or lottery. So Ted either loses a hand for sure, or 1 billion people enter a fair lottery. 1,000 of these people, by the way, there's like a mistake later on in the slides where I return to this case where there's a different number, but it shouldn't affect your intuitions. 1,000 of these people are randomly selected by the lottery, and those people die. So suppose you can only save one of the two groups. So to be clear, what's going on here is you can either prevent one person from losing a hand, or you can prevent 1,000 people from dying. It's just that you don't know who it is that you will save. Now, the ex-ante view says that we should save Ted. Why is that? Because Ted has a very strong claim against having his hand being lost, whereas the people who enter the lottery, they only have tiny risks of death. Each of them individually only has a small claim. All of those claims are so small that they count as irrelevant next to losing a hand. Therefore, the only claim that's in play is Ted's claim against losing a hand, and so we should save Ted. But I think this is clearly absurd. Obviously, faced with a choice between saving one person's hand and saving 1,000 people from death, we should save the 1,000 people from death. It might matter that those people are unidentified, but it doesn't matter so much that 1,000 deaths can be outweighed by one hand. So Johann Frick, probably the most famous proponent of this view, is aware of this problem, and he has this following kind of response, that we should appeal to something like aggregate goodness in these sorts of cases. However, if we do this straightforwardly, just like literally appealing to total well-being or something, this definitely won't work, as Seth Lazarus pointed out, because then we'll have to prevent headaches rather than deaths, because we can make the amount of aggregate well-being at stake arbitrarily large. So it's going to have to be more complicated. And Johann Frick does recognize this in his paper. He says so in the footnote. Unfortunately, he doesn't really give an account. And in any case, it seems to me that we're back where we started with, and we haven't really solved the problem at all. And so, given that the ex-ante view just doesn't really solve the problem it's supposed to solve, namely explaining partial aggregation, the view, I think, is really the ex-ante view. So now consider the following kind of case, which I call vaccination program. So imagine you can vaccinate 100 million children, and each will have a 1 in a million risk of death. If unvaccinated, each child will suffer a harm which is a little too small to be relevant when compared to certain death. So the ex-post view here says don't vaccinate. Why is that? Well, it's because with 100 million children, each having a 1 in a million risk of death, it is all but certain that at least one child will die. And so somebody will have a claim that is basically as strong as a claim against death. Remember, we're not interested in the ex-post view on each individual's risk of death. What we're interested in is the risk that somebody will die, not a particular person. So the ex-post view seems to say here, don't vaccinate. And yet I think common sense says that we should clearly vaccinate. After all, it's well advancing the interests of each individual person. Each child has only a 1 in a million risk of death. And in return for taking on this risk, they avoid this harm, which, while irrelevant to certain death, might still be quite substantial. Imagine, for example, it's a lost finger or something like that. So could we believe that it's forbidden to vaccinate in this case? Maybe we could. I don't find it very intuitive, but I don't think this is a decisive strike against the theory. Still, I think there's a bigger problem for the ex-post view, which has to do with the separateness of persons. So what do I mean by this? So the point of partial aggregation, according to many of its proponents, is to chart a kind of middle course between aggregating and between never aggregating. So when you're aggregating, you compare the harms and benefits happening to many to the harms and benefits happening to many. But when you're doing this non-aggregative thing, you're instead comparing 1 to 1. So the way that partial aggregation does this non-aggregative thing is that when it's checking for relevance, it's supposed to compare people 1 to 1 and never 1 to many or many to many. So if you don't believe me, here's Verhoeven basically saying so. I won't read through this because of lack of time, but you can just sort of have a read through on your handout if you like. I think that these kinds of thoughts that most proponents of partial aggregation endorse justify two things. First, I call this the individualist restriction on claims. And it says that the relevance and strength of an individual's claim against having a risk of harm imposed, it can't depend on the number of equally strong claims with which it competes. So whether I've got like a claim against, whether my claim against a risk of death is relevant doesn't depend on whether there are many, 10 or 1 or 1,000 people who face death if I'm not saved. It just depends on an individual person's claim. Neither can the relevance of a claim depend on the claims with which it can be jointly served. So what I mean here is, for example, if we return to the original deaths versus headaches case, we can't say something like, suppose I'm having the headache. If you save me, you don't only save me, you also save all these other people from having the headaches. And together, that's a much larger thing. And therefore, our claim should be counted as relevant. Partial aggregation people say, no, can't do that. It has to be 1 to 1. So 1 headache to 1 death. It's too small, so it's irrelevant. I think it also justifies this principle, which I call only particular people have claims, and I think it's pretty clear enough what that means. So going back to our case, the benefits of vaccination and vaccination program are relevant to a small risk of 1 person dying. So they're relevant to many such risks. So that's supposed to follow from the individualist restriction. Let's slow down a bit and think about that. So if we imagine that we could give all of the benefits of vaccination for everybody, in return for 1 person having a 1 in a million risk of death, then I take it it's extremely clear that we ought to vaccinate. If it's just 1 person who has a 1 in a million risk of death, at that point, it's extremely likely that nobody will die as a result and will prevent a large number of serious harms. They're serious, just not strong enough to be relevant next to death. If that's so, though, these risks of death, even when you've got many of them, they still don't suffice to make the benefits of vaccination irrelevant, or so I say. And that's in contrast to the ex post view, where the relevance depends on competition with an aggregate of claims. So when many people risk of death, bottom line, it's more likely that someone dies, but none of those people are more likely to die. No individual person has a stronger claim. The thought is that the ex post view, in appealing to this, the importance of whether somebody has a claim, but not a particular person, it actually involves lumping people's claims together. Because whether somebody will die doesn't just depend on whether 1 person has a risk, it depends on whether there are also other people who face risks, even though those risks have nothing to do with each other. So we're in a bit of a problem here. The ex ante view basically gets things right, I think, sort of theoretically, about vaccination program and the saving of persons, but surely we can't believe that we should save 1 person's hand rather than saving 1,000 lives. The ex post view, on the other hand, gets things right in that kind of case, but it's wrong about the separateness of persons. So I think this kind of raises the question, ¿por qué no los dos? Why can't we have both, not giving undue priority to identified over statistical lives and at the same time respect to the separateness of persons? And I think we can, and I'm going to explain that now. So let's recall our earlier case. This is the one where I made a mistake, and now I said there's 1 million of these tickets being randomly selected. But if you imagine that a 1 in 1,000 risk of death is irrelevant next to certain death, then this wouldn't change your mind. Otherwise, just imagine I wrote down the previous case. So I think we should accept 2 premises. First is that you should save the many because they have relevant claims in this kind of case of identified versus statistical lives. And the second thing I think we should accept is this individualist restriction on claims, because that's motivated by these kinds of non-aggregative intuitions, which I think are really essential to motivating the partial aggregationist project in the first place. So here's a kind of argument. Yeah, here's a kind of argument then. So the claims of the many facing the lottery, this one here, they're relevant in death or lottery. That's the premise we started with. By the individualist restriction, then, they would be relevant if only 1 person were facing the lottery. So that is, if we, so here we've got death or lottery, Ted dies for sure, 1 billion people, 1 million people are selected from those billion, and those people die. So the claims of the many facing the lottery, this one here, they're relevant. We need to say that because otherwise we won't be able to explain why it's the case that you should save the 1 million lives rather than the 1 life. Okay, so then the thought is if there's only 1 person having a lottery, so if we choose between saving 1 person for sure and preventing 1 person from having a 1 in 1,000 or a 1 in a million risk of death, then that person's claim should be relevant. Okay, so I'm saying their claim is relevant. I'm not saying that it outweighs the person's claim against certain death, just that it should be counted. Okay. So if we apply the individualist restriction again, it would also, they would have a relevant claim there if everybody who entered the lottery before instead lost on the same number. So instead of it being guaranteed that 1 million people will die, it is a 1 in a billion chance that anyone will die, but if one of them dies, they all die. So everyone has the same risk, but now their risks are all perfectly correlated with each other. The individualist restriction requires that we should treat this situation exactly the same way. And that means that the risks of death are relevant in cases like deaths versus risks of death, the kind of case that I started with. So what we have is an argument from the individualist restriction saying that unless we're prepared to prioritize identified over statistical lives, no matter how many statistical lives, then we must accept that when there's a small chance that a large number of people will die, that those people's claims are relevant. And of course, if those people's claims are relevant, then because if there's enough of them, they're going to outweigh the smaller number of claims against certain death. Okay, so that's basically almost the whole talk. I'm just going to kind of skip this thing because it's a bit confusing. Yeah, I don't really like it. But you can read through and ask me about that if you're interested in the discussion. Let me just give you like a target so you can sort of throw things at it. So here's the view I'm going to propose. Oh, I can't do that without slightly explaining these things, so let's go back. So what's going on, I think, there are people talk about the strength of a claim, but I think they're actually confusing three conceptually distinct notions. So one is what I might call the aggregative strength of a claim. And what I mean by that is, suppose the claim is relevant. How powerful a reason does it generate? Okay. The second is what I call the relevance retaining strength of the claim. That means how good is that claim at remaining relevant, even though it competes with other strong claims. And the third one is the irrelevance making strength of the claim. That is, how good is a claim at making other claims irrelevant? So take, say, a claim against certain death. That has both great relevance retaining strength. It's really hard to make a claim against certain death irrelevant if it's possible at all. I think it's probably not. And it's also good at making other things irrelevant. It can make, for example, claims against headaches irrelevant. What I think I should show, though, and what I think this argument shows, is that small risks of severe harms, they have great relevance retaining strength. But we need not think that, therefore, they're good at making other things irrelevant. So we can say that a small risk of death, you can't ignore it, but that doesn't mean that it means that you've got to ignore headaches when they compete with this. That's what I'm saying. So here's the sort of concrete view. I suggest that perhaps the relevance retaining strength of a person's claim might correspond to the size of the harm that might eventuate. So if there's a risk of death, it corresponds to the size of the harm of death. And if you want to render that irrelevant, you need something that's powerful enough to render certain death irrelevant. The aggregate of irrelevance making strengths of claims, however, I say, correspond to the expected loss of well-being. So in that respect, it works like the ex-ante view. I call this the ex-ante claims ex-post relevance view. And because I'm slightly bored and because I want to have time for questions, I think I'll skip over a bunch of objections and just ask what you think. Yeah, thank you very much.